5 years ago, there were huge numbers of low-income minority voters in North Carolina going to the polls. North Carolina was actually ahead of many southern states in sort of getting voters who had otherwise, throughout the 20th century, had failed to participate in the electoral process. And North Carolina was succeeding in getting those people out to the polls. Then in 2010, as we all know, Republicans had a big election day, not just on the federal level, but in state elections across the country, and Republicans swept into office, took over the North Carolina legislature. Then in 2013, just last year, they went ahead and passed that voter suppression law. Now, for the 5 years prior to that, from 2007 to 2012, there was two organizations in North Carolina, Civitas, or Civitas, C-I-V-I-T-A-S, and the John Locke Foundation. They worked for stricter voting laws. And here's how they did that. Civitas and the John Locke Foundation, they first got major funding from a guy named Art Pope, who is generally described as the Koch brother, the long-lost Koch brother of North Carolina. So since 2007, that network, they published over 40 articles, they got in news stories, they got in blog posts, and they had a goal to accomplish three things. Those stories, those posts were all about ending same-day registration, shortening the voter time would be the second time, shortening the early voter time, and the third thing was a photo ID law. And what do you know, when they passed that law in 2013, those were the three things in it, that voter suppression law. Now there's word that comes out that 300,000 voters in North Carolina, 300,000 people who are already on the voting rolls, don't have the proper photo ID to meet that standard. That's 300,000 people who are already capable of voting. Forget about all the people that they don't want to come in and register to vote prior to the midterms in 2014 or in the presidential cycle in 2016. 29% of early voters and 34% of same-day voters were black. They, again, want to end the same-day voting and restrict the early voting. Those numbers disproportionately black. It's a story we've heard again and again and again. Going back into the 20th century, we know about the poll tax, we know about the literacy test. By the way, one thing I didn't realize is if you had a poll tax, which was designed to keep black people from voting, there was an exemption to the poll tax, which is just so obvious, I can't believe I didn't know it. But the poll tax, they'd come up and they'd say you owe whatever it is, a quarter, $1 to vote for people who didn't have that kind of money. But if you were eligible to vote, not even a voter, but just eligible to vote prior to 1896, meaning if you were white, then you got an exemption to the poll tax. So the result was, between 1896 and 1904 in North Carolina, nearly all black voters were expunged from the rolls. Now, the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was, of course, an effort to rectify this situation, and then it did. And then the Supreme Court comes along in 2013 with its decision, and all of a sudden we start rolling back the clock. And states like North Carolina, that had this long history, although recent success, but this long history of discrimination, are suddenly able to go ahead with their Republican legislatures and push through these terrible, awful bills. So that's the bad news. The good news is what has happened now in North Carolina, at the federal level, is that after the Supreme Court decision overturning much of the Voting Rights Act, there all of a sudden is a movement in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. But the interesting part is the House of Representatives led a bill sponsored by John Conyers, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, no surprise there, and his co-sponsor is a Republican, James Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin. Sensenbrenner is a totally interesting guy, because this is a legislator who has more than once, significantly irritated the Republican leadership led by John Boehner in the House of Representatives by going against them. And one of the things that he has gone against them on is the Voting Rights Act. And he said after that Supreme Court decision in 2013 that he knew instantly that something had to be done. So let me give you a couple of quotes from this piece, because they're totally interesting. First of all, the Senate bill is sponsored by Patrick Leahy from Vermont. And here's what Leahy has to say. Through months and months of negotiation and compromise, Congressman Sensenbrenner and Conyers and I have agreed on a bipartisan, bicameral proposal to restore the protection of the Voting Rights Act that were weakened by the Supreme Court's decision last summer. That's the first quote from Leahy. Here's the second. Our sole focus, he says, throughout this entire process was to ensure that no American would be denied his or her constitutional right to vote because of discrimination on the basis of race or color. We believe this is a strong bipartisan bill that accomplishes this goal and that every member of Congress can support. The idea that we were going to get a bipartisan bill to undo what the Supreme Court did on the Voting Rights Act, I don't know, I find stunning. I didn't know Sensenbrenner's history until I read about it today. And here's what Sensenbrenner has to say about this. He says, this legislation is a direct response to Shelby County versus Holder. That's the Supreme Court's 2013 decision. When that ruling came down last summer, I knew the Voting Rights Act must be fixed before the next election, and any solution must be politically palatable while complying with the objections of the Supreme Court. Sensenbrenner continues, the modernized Voting Rights Act is constitutional and bipartisan. It includes strong nationwide anti-discrimination protections and continues to permit states to enact reasonable voter ID laws. Therefore, it prevents racial discrimination and gives states the ability to address voter fraud. That's obviously an incredibly significant point because you got John Conyers and Pat Leahy, and the bill that Leahy has proposed in the Senate is exactly the same as the Conyers-Sensenbrenner bill in the House. It enables states to have some voter ID, which I hate and which most progressives hate. But it is saying you can have some form of voter ID, but perhaps if it included some system where there was significant effort to help voters get that ID, well, then maybe it wouldn't be so bad and wouldn't necessarily be an effort to undermine voting by minority voters. So the key provisions of the bill include coverage based on the current conditions. So it does roll up the clock a little bit instead of looking back at your past discrimination. This bill would only look at the last 15 years. So if you've been good for the last 15 years, then they'll continue to presume that you're good. But it would allow the federal courts to come in before an election or to try to fix things before an election if they saw a law that was going to prevent minority voters from voting. That's a huge deal because most of the time we'd have these things come in, we'd find out that black voters have been disenfranchised, and then after the fact they'd go, well, that's outrageous. We can't let that happen again until the next election. So it would empower the federal courts to get involved at a meaningful time. Greater transparency in elections so that voters are made aware of changes, so that nothing can be done surreptitiously, nothing can be done by cover of night, nothing can be done where you claim to be enhancing the voter's experience while in fact you're preventing people from voting. And you can't say that you're in the process of rectifying voter fraud when there is no voter fraud, when what you really want to do is, again, prevent blacks and other minorities from voting, and obviously from voting Democratic. Allows for preliminary relief to be obtained more readily. That's what I was talking about, given that voting rights cannot often be vindicated after an election is already over, which is very clear if you've been prevented from voting or your vote didn't count, or a whole swath of people like you didn't have your vote counted so that someone you didn't like got into office. It's a little too late if it happens after the election. And then includes modest provisions that continue to permit states to enact reasonable photo ID laws. So Sensenbrenner is saying, hey, look, I'm giving you a little. I'm giving the Republicans a little of what they want here. But if John Conyers and Pat Leahy are behind this, then it's obviously an improvement over just leaving the Supreme Court decision in as is. I think it's a great step forward. The issue now will be whether that Republican leadership, whether John Boehner and Eric Cantor, in any way can get people to back a bipartisan bill that Sensenbrenner backed. Or has this guy gone against the Republican leadership too often, meaning ever, and that they don't want any part of this? My hunch is they don't want any part of it. But from a purely political point of view, getting a fairly mainstream Republican who's been in the House a long time and getting him to go along with this is a great, great sign, and it is at least a political weapon the Democrats can use against Republicans to try to pressure them to pass this. Because I still, to this day, I don't know how all of us, all Americans, let alone members of the media, go continually so incredibly easy on people who make it their sole goal to make it harder for other Americans to vote.